city was alive tonight, its streets humming with energy, the distant rumble of traffic echoing like a pulse. Jason stumbled from the pub into the chill of the midnight air, his coat slung over his arm. His friends had long since gone home, but the night still called to him, a reprieve from the pressures of life, a crumbling marriage, unpaid bills, and a job that chipped away at his soul. He pulled his phone from his pocket, its cracked screen blinking to life. 2:47. Jason sighed, stuffing it back as he began walking toward the shortcut through the alleys. Narrow paths, lined with graffiti-scarred walls and scattered trash. Shadows clung to the brickwork, deep and unnerving, but Jason didn't care. He just wanted to get home. It started with footsteps, soft, deliberate, just beyond his line of hearing. Jason paused, turning to glance behind him. Nothing. The alley stretched empty, save for the glisten of rain-soaked concrete. He chuckled nervously to himself and kept walking. The footsteps came again, closer this time. "Hello?" Jason's voice echoed back to him, brittle and uncertain. He picked up his pace, his shoes slapping against the wet ground. A whisper of movement slid across the alley's mouth behind him. He turned quickly, but saw nothing. A trick of the light, perhaps. But then he felt it. An unnatural chill slithered through the air, like the world itself was holding its breath. Jason's skin prickled as he froze in place. A tall, spindly figure emerged from the shadows, gliding silently toward him. Its presence seemed wrong, as though it wasn't walking, but slipping across the earth, untouched by gravity or sound. Jason's heart pounded. "What do you want?" The figure stopped, just on the edge of the light. It was gaunt and emaciated, its skin stretched thin and brittle like aged parchment over sharp, prominent bones. Its face was almost featureless, 2 hollow indentations where eyes should be, and a slit of a mouth that moved unnaturally, twitching and quivering as though unused to forming expressions. "I said, what do you—" The creature moved. In an instant, it was on him, its skeletal hand pressing against his chest like a vice. Pinning him to the wall, Jason gasped, his body writhing in terror. Its face loomed close now, its mouth parting to reveal thin, needle-like teeth, blackened as if from rot. Jason felt his energy draining, a pulling sensation that gnawed at his very core. "No, please," Jason sobbed, tears streaming. "I have kids. Please, I have kids." The creature tilted its head, almost curiously, as though trying to understand the words. Its voice, when it spoke, was like air passing through dry reeds, soft and empty. "I have no hatred for you," it whispered, "but as the lion hunts, so too must I feed. I do not choose this. It is the cycle. It has always been the cycle." Jason's pleas dissolved into choking gasps. The light in his eyes dimmed as the creature fed, its victim's body crumbling to the ground like a puppet with severed strings. The thing stood over him for a moment, silent and still, before turning. It melted into the shadows, disappearing as though it had never been there at all. The hideout. The creature's lair was hidden beneath the earth, an ancient basement swallowed by the city's expansion. Crumbling brick walls loomed over a room scattered with relics, broken statues, rusted chains, and yellowed parchment bearing languages no one spoke anymore. At the center of it all, a cluster of monitors cast a cold, flickering glow over the creature's skeletal form. He sat hunched in a dilapidated chair, staring at the screens. The news played on loop, showing the same stories of politicians, celebrities, and consumer distractions. The election race heats up, with candidates clashing over box office records, broken again by the latest superhero film. Public outrage, as scandals divide communities. The creature, ancient and tired, leaned forward, his hollow sockets staring into the chaos with neither judgment nor emotion. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, as though the air itself strained to carry it. You scurry, distracted by what you were told matters. What flag to wave, what colour to vote for, what voice to follow. Meanwhile, he paused, his brittle fingers tapping the monitor. The lion still hunts, the spider still feeds, and so do I. He sat back, his cracked lips curling faintly in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Survival, he continued, is the only truth, the base of all life. No malice, no morality, just the hunger that drives us all. The monitors buzzed faintly as images flashed across their screens. Wars, celebrations, protests, families at dinner tables. A world oblivious to his existence, spinning forward as it always had. The creature, older than language, older than cities, watched it all with neither contempt nor sympathy. Once, they called me Sythras, feeder of the hollow places. He traced the outline of his face, reflected faintly in the screen, a shadow of a shadow. They knew the truth then, but truth becomes myth, and myth fades to dust. Sythras rose, his bones creaking like old wood, and moved to a nearby corner of the room. Here the remains of his last feed lay crumpled. A jacket, a wallet, a photo of Jason with 2 smiling children. Sythras looked at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The monitors flickered again. Outside the city continued its ceaseless motion, unaware of the ancient predator hidden beneath its streets. Sythras stepped back into the shadows of his lair, where the light could not reach, leaving only the hum of the screens behind him. The dark of the lair clung to Sythras like a shroud as he stirred from his rest. Dust rose from the brittle folds of his tattered cloak, the weight of countless centuries pressing against the silence. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened his ancient frame, bones creaking, as if the act of rising had become more burdensome with each passing millennium. His voice rasped through the shadows, soft yet resonant, a whisper that felt older than language itself. And so the cycle continues. Once more must I feed. Once more must the nature of Sythras take from the cycle what the cycle gives. As the lion must hunt, so too must I. He drifted forward, his movements fluid yet unnatural, like smoke carried on the wind. The glow of the monitors flickered behind him, forgotten. Above, the city was stirring once more, its lifeblood, its people, flowing through streets unaware of the predator that hunted among them. The streets of the city. It was a cold, black night, thick with mist that crept through the alleys like a living thing. The hum of neon signs buzzed faintly above the sound of footsteps, hurried, drunken footsteps, cutting through the dead silence. Near the mouth of a narrow alley, the noise of a scuffle shattered the quiet. A man lay curled on the ground, shielding his head, as 3 burly figures stood over him, fists and boots striking without restraint. You think you can talk to her like that, you piece of trash? One of the men bellowed, voice slurred by alcohol. Please, please, the man on the floor cried, blood dripping from his split lip. I didn't say anything, stop. Liar. Another kick landed hard against his ribs. Sythras watched from the veil of darkness nearby, unmoving, silent, like a shadow given shape. His hollow sockets regarded the scene, empty yet perceptive. He heard the pleas for mercy, saw the suffering, but there was no judgment in him, no concern. For what was violence but another cycle, hunter and hunted, predator and prey? Then it came, the scent, blood, fresh, alive. It stirred something deep within him, something primal and unstoppable. The hunger, always lurking beneath the surface, rose like a flood, and the creature's thin lips curled as he inhaled. His mouth twitched, teeth sharp as needles gleaming faintly in the darkness. The man on the ground groaned, glancing up through bloodied eyes, just as the beating stopped. The three attackers froze, confusion flashing across their drunken expressions. Then the first man was flung backward, his body smashing into the alley wall with a sickening crack before crumpling into a heap. The other two staggered in shock, barely registering what had happened before an invisible force swatted them aside like insects. One crashed into a trash bin, another tumbled across the pavement. Limbs sprawled awkwardly. The man on the ground blinked in disbelief, his breathing ragged. What the hell? He pushed himself up onto shaky hands and knees, staring through the haze of pain at the figure standing before him. Sythras loomed there, unnaturally tall and thin, his gaunt frame casting an elongated shadow across the alley. He seemed lifeless, a walking corpse, with skin like aged parchment, stretched over brittle bones. His hollow eyes regarded the man without expression. "Thank you," the man gasped, blood dripping onto the pavement as he forced himself to stand. "Thank you. Those idiots were going to kill me." Sythras tilted his head slowly, his face devoid of empathy, of pity, of anything at all. The man's gratitude meant nothing. All Sythras saw, all he felt, was the hunger. The smell of the man's blood was intoxicating, filling the air with the warmth of life. His fingers twitched as the urges overwhelmed him, the cravings too powerful to resist. Sythras moved, fast, fluid, unstoppable, as his skeletal hand gripped the man by the shoulder, pulling him close. The man's relief turned to horror. "Wait, no, what are you?" The creature's hollow mouth opened, revealing a row of blackened, needle-like teeth. Sythras leaned in, his grip tightening like an iron vice as the man began to struggle. "No," the man screamed, thrashing weakly. "I thought you were helping me." Sythras paused, as if considering the words, before speaking softly, his voice like the whisper of death. "Why would I help my feed?" The man's scream echoed into the night as Sythras fed. His teeth sank deep, and the man's body convulsed as the very essence of his life was drained. His energy, his warmth, his vitality, all consumed. The beating of his heart slowed, faltered, and finally stopped, leaving only a lifeless husk to crumple at the creature's feet. The return to shadows. Sythras rose, wiping the thin streak of blood from his lips with a slow, deliberate motion. The hunger had abated for now, but it would return. It always returned. He turned, leaving the alley in silence, the bodies strewn across the pavement like discarded puppets. The shadows welcomed him as he slipped back into the forgotten places of the city. His ancient hideout awaited, its air thick with the weight of time. Sythras stood once more before the flickering monitors, their glow reflecting faintly in his hollow sockets. The news was the same as always, faces arguing, scandals debated, trivialities that kept the world blind to its basest truth. "Survival," he whispered, sitting down once more. "It is the only constant. The lion hunts, the spider feeds, and so do I." He leaned closer to the screen, watching as the news anchor droned on about chaos, politics, and fame. "You distract yourselves with stories of power, with illusions of meaning. But beneath it all, there is only the hunger, yours and mine." Sythras settled into the chair, the faint hum of the monitors buzzing around him as the cycle, ancient and unbroken, continued. The darkness of the lair was absolute, save for the cold glow of the monitors, their flickering light casting faint, restless shadows across the crumbling walls. Sythras sat motionless in his chair, his hollow sockets staring unblinkingly at the screens before him. War, scandal, politics, fear. The same stories recycled through decades, dressed in new faces and colours. One screen showed images of a burning city. Another displayed the shouting faces of politicians. A third played a segment of celebrity gossip, laughter and forced smiles, echoing in the silence of the room. Sythras spoke softly, his voice no louder than a breath, but it filled the empty space with the weight of eternity. I have lived for centuries. This never changes. Always the same. His thin lips twitched faintly, as if tasting the bitterness of the words. I have watched as they feed you this illusion. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, they give you this distraction. Your wars, your fears, your stories of right and wrong, while the truth lingers unseen. You are nothing more than prey. His bony fingers tapped slowly on the armrest of his chair, a sound like dry twigs snapping. His hollow gaze never left the screens as they danced with false promises and empty outrage. Then something changed. One of the monitors flickered, its program cutting abruptly to a news broadcast. Sythras stilled, his unnatural stillness becoming absolute, like a predator sensing movement in the brush. The screen now displayed a man standing before a familiar alleyway, dimly lit police lights flashing behind him. The man, mid-40s, unshaven and wide-eyed, gripped the microphone as though it were his lifeline. I know what I saw. The man's voice trembled with both fear and excitement. The authorities don't believe me, but I saw it with my own eyes. It wasn't human. It was something else. A creature. A monster. The broadcast cut to shaky phone footage. The grainy image showed glimpses of something tall and shadowy in the corner of the alley, a figure with unnaturally thin limbs and a hollow, faceless visage. Its movements too quick to be human. The camera shook violently, and then the screen went dark. The man on the TV returned, his expression more resolute. I've heard the stories, the myths about vampires. For years, people have dismissed them, laughed them off. But I have proof now. Proof that something ancient, something predatory is walking among us. Sythras leaned forward slightly, a faint creaking of his old chair breaking the silence. His hollow sockets narrowed in interest, a flicker of something, not quite emotion, but close, passing over his ancient features. I have spent the last day gathering evidence. The man continued, holding up a bloodied scrap of clothing, Jason's jacket, torn and familiar. And I will not stop here. I am tracking this creature to prove it exists. I will find it. I will expose it to the world. The man's voice rose with conviction. To the thing that did this, I know you're out there. I will find you. The monitor's glow reflected in Sythras' gaunt face as he sat perfectly still, the words hanging in the air like smoke, and then, for the first time in centuries, his lips moved. A faint, unnatural sound echoed through the room. A smile. It was barely perceptible. The curl of those cracked lips, but it was there. Sythras spoke, his voice carrying an edge it had not held in countless years, as if something long dormant had stirred deep within him. Then come, he whispered softly, his words lingering like a hiss in the dark. Come find Sythras. The monitors buzzed faintly, their light flickering across his ancient, withered face. And in the silence of the room, Sythras sat back once more, that faint, unsettling smile lingering as the news anchor's voice droned on. For the first time in centuries, the predator felt a flicker of anticipation. Let us see, Sythras murmured to the empty room. If the hunter knows he is prey. The small apartment was dim, lit only by the glow of a flickering computer screen. Papers were strewn across the desk, handwritten notes, scrawled with desperate theories, ancient symbols, and frantically circled words like vampire, immortal, and Sythras. The man from the television sat hunched over the chaos, tapping away at his keyboard with trembling fingers. His name was David Kress, and he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were red-rimmed, dark circles bruising his pale skin. A half-empty coffee cup sat forgotten next to his shaking hand as he muttered to himself, "I will find you. I must find you." He reached for a small, framed photograph, propped against his monitor. It showed a little girl with a wide, fragile smile, her head bald from treatments, an IV tube snaking from her arm. David's voice broke as he whispered to the photo. "Stage 4 now. They say weeks at most. I can't let you go. I can't." A buzzing sound filled the air, the single bulb above him flickering, casting stuttering shadows across the room. David ignored it, his eyes fixed on the photo. "I've tried everything. Everything. They can't help you. They won't help you." The buzzing grew louder, the light flaring brighter and brighter until... Pop! The bulb exploded in a burst of glass and sparks, plunging the room into darkness. David jumped, his heart hammering as he fumbled for the desk lamp. It refused to turn on. A new sound drifted through the room, a low hum, like the groaning of an ancient wind moving through unseen cracks. Slowly, impossibly, the darkness deepened. Not the absence of light, but a presence of something else. It pooled in the corners, thick and heavy, and moved. David froze, the air turning icy as the shadows drained what little light remained. And then he saw it. A figure emerged, tall, thin, and impossibly dark. It was as if the creature swallowed the light around it, a void given shape. The shadows clung to its form, trailing like tattered smoke. Its hollow sockets gleamed faintly, reflecting nothing. David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Sythras stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried no malice, only an ancient, dispassionate authority. "So," he whispered, "you seek Sythras. How interesting." David stumbled back, his chair scraping against the floor. Sythras tilted his head, his hollow sockets fixed on the trembling man. "Tell me, has the gazelle ever sought out the lion? Has the fly looked to converse with the spider?" The creature's lips curled faintly, almost in mockery. "Yet here you are, thinking you hunt the hunter." David shook his head frantically, his voice trembling. I don't hunt you, I swear. I just..." Sythras cut him off with a slow, fluid step forward. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against David's chest as the creature loomed over him. "For centuries," Sythras murmured, "I have preyed on your kind, and yet my fill is hardly noticed in the grand scheme of what you do to each other." He gestured toward the lifeless screens. "Your wars, your man-made diseases, your people poisoning themselves willingly every day. I am insignificant compared to your self-destruction." Sythras leaned closer, his skeletal frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow David whole. "And yet you seek out Sythras. Then let Sythras shorten your journey." The creature's hand shot forward, a claw-like grip closing around David's collar. The man let out a strangled cry, but in his desperation, he fumbled for the photograph, thrusting it toward the monster's face. "Please," David gasped. "Master, please." The word hung in the air, sharp and unexpected. Sythras stilled. David, panting, held the photo higher. "She will die. My daughter. Look at her. She's all I have. My life means nothing to me." Sythras's grip slackened, just slightly. He tilted his head, his hollow gaze shifting to the photograph. For the first time in untold years, something stirred within him, not compassion, but curiosity. "You call me master," Sythras said softly, his voice a dry whisper. "None have spoken that word to me in an age. I have dwelled in shadow, hidden from your world and its illusions, and yet you have sought out Sythras." David nodded frantically, his tears falling onto the photo. "I have. I know the truth. I know what they hide. Our leaders, our healers, our society. They lie to us. They feed us fear. They use our own duty, our own need for approval against us. They distract us with illusions, religion, politics, greed, while we die. But you..." David looked up, trembling but resolute. "You hide nothing. You are the hunter. We are the prey. I accept that, but you do not lie. I trust you more than them." Sythras stared at him, unmoving. "I've tried everything," David continued, his voice cracking. "I've lied. I've stolen. I've cheated. Anything to save her. But nothing has worked. No amount of money or science can help her. I know you do not care. You are right to see me as nothing. But I offer you this, Master. I offer you my life." He dropped to his knees, holding the photo out with both hands. "Take me. Feed on me. But save her. I beg of you." The room fell deathly silent. Sythras' head tilted once more, his hollow sockets fixed on the man. Slowly he extended a hand and took the photograph, holding it between his thin, clawed fingers. He stared at it, his expression unreadable. "Tell me," Sythras said, his voice a soft, hollow murmur. "Why should I help you? You are but a fly in my web." David looked up, tears streaming down his face. Because you are honest. You are the truth. And I have nothing left but my truth. Please." The faintest sound, something almost like a sigh, escaped Sythras as he looked once more at the photograph. For the briefest of moments, the shadows seemed to flicker. Then, without warning, Sythras leaned in. David's eyes widened in horror as the creature's sharp teeth parted. Wait! But Sythras' grip was unrelenting. The man's scream was brief, swallowed by the shadows. The sun rose weakly over the city, pale light seeping into David Cress's apartment. The door remained locked, the curtains drawn. Inside, David's body sat slumped in his chair, his eyes closed as though he had simply fallen asleep. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds, nothing to suggest the violence that had occurred. Yet David's skin was pale, his lips colourless, his body empty of life. On the desk, beside his crumpled notes and computer, the photograph of a little girl remained untouched, and in the silence of the room, it seemed as though the shadows lingered just a little longer before retreating into the corners, leaving behind nothing but the faint hum of a lifeless monitor. The hospital room was a storm of chaos. Monitors screamed their warnings in shrill beeps, a relentless alarm that sent shivers through every nurse and doctor crowded around the small bed. Ella, just 8 years old, lay still as her shallow breathing wheezed softly through an oxygen mask. Her skin was pale, nearly translucent, her frail chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. Her mother, Sarah Cress, clutched her child's hand, her knuckles white. "Please!" she cried, her voice raw and broken. "Why won't she wake up? Why?" A doctor gently touched her shoulder. His expression was carefully practiced, cold, professional sympathy hiding the defeat in his eyes. "Mrs. Cress, I'm sorry. We did everything we could. Her body is failing. It's..." "No," Sarah screamed, shoving the doctor's hand away. "You're lying. Do something." The nurses exchanged helpless glances, their faces drawn in grief. The steady rhythm of Ella's heartbeat on the monitor began to slow, each beep stretching longer apart. The lights in the room dimmed inexplicably, flickering and buzzing faintly as though something unseen were draining their energy. The doctor swallowed hard, his voice soft as he murmured, "It's time. I'm so sorry." Sarah collapsed over her daughter's motionless body, sobbing into the sheets. Ella's breaths were shallow now, her small chest barely moving at all. The monitors slowed further. Beep, beep, beep. Then the lights exploded. Glass shattered with a deafening crash, sparks cascading like tiny stars before vanishing into the sudden, suffocating darkness. The room fell silent. The machines cut out, their screens blinking to black. From the far corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest, something moved. A figure stepped forward, tall and thin, wrapped in darkness that seemed to swallow the light around it. The shadows clung to it, trailing like smoke, as if the thing itself was part of the void. Sythras emerged, his hollow sockets fixed on the girl lying in the bed, his movements unnaturally slow, deliberate. The doctors and nurses froze, unable to speak, paralyzed by the primal terror that radiated from the figure. Sarah's head shot up, her tear-streaked face twisting in horror. "Get away from her!" she shrieked, lunging toward Sythras, like a mother lion protecting her cub. Sythras extended one skeletal hand and raised a single finger to his cracked lips. Shh! The sound carried like a breeze of death through the room, and Sarah froze mid-step, her breath hitching. "I was sent," Sythras said softly, his voice hollow and ancient, resonating as though from a cavernous abyss. "The one you called David has made a bargain, and I always honor the deal of my loyal servants." Sarah stared at him, her trembling hand covering her mouth. "David," she whispered. Sythras drifted forward, approaching the bed. The girl's eyes fluttered weakly, and with a monumental effort, she managed to open one. For a moment, she stared up at the figure looming over her, a dark silhouette against the fragmented light. Sythras leaned in, his skeletal hand hovering over her face. "He has paid," he whispered. "I now deliver." Sarah tried to scream, to move, but she could only watch in stunned disbelief as Sythras lowered his hand over Ella's mouth. From his withered palm, a dark shadow began to pour forth, tendrils of black mist seeping into the girl's fragile body. Ella's small frame convulsed violently, her limbs jerking as if unseen hands were pulling at her. Her monitors, though dead, began to hum faintly with energy. The doctors stepped back, their expressions shifting from terror to awe as the impossible unfolded before them. And then it stopped. Ella fell still, her chest silent. The room hung in perfect quiet, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Sythras straightened, drifting backward, his form blending into the shadows once more. And then Ella sat up. Sarah gasped, tears spilling down her face as she threw her arms around her daughter. Ella, my baby, you're alive, you're alive." The doctors hesitated, staring in disbelief as Ella moved. One of them rushed forward, stammering, "This is impossible. She shouldn't even be able to sit up. Her vitals." Ella turned to face him. Her expression was calm, too calm. "Not because of you," she said softly, "but because of my daddy." Before the doctor could react, Ella's small body moved with unnatural speed. She lunged at the doctor's neck, her teeth sinking deep into his flesh. Blood sprayed across the white hospital walls as the man crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Sarah screamed, stumbling backward as her daughter, her frail dying child, turned to face her. Ella's eyes were no longer the soft brown Sarah knew. They were black, endless and hollow, like the void itself. From the darkened corner of the room, where the shadows still writhed unnaturally, a hand emerged. Thin and clawed, it reached toward the girl as a voice echoed softly through the stillness. "Come, my child. This world of illusion is no longer for you." Ella stood, her movements fluid. She drifted toward the corner of the room, her small figure swallowed by the shadows. At the threshold, she turned back one last time. Her gaze found her mother, tears glistening in Sarah's eyes. "Goodbye, Mummy," Ella said softly, her voice strangely serene. "Thank you for trying so hard. Daddy gave his life so I could step out of this illusion, but I must go now. Know that I still exist, and I am pain-free." The shadows consumed her, and she was gone. Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobbing, her cries echoing through the ruined, blood-stained room. The lights flickered faintly, struggling to return, but the shadows lingered in the corners, dark, ancient, and hungry. And somewhere deep within them, Sythras smiled. The darkness inside the old cathedral was oppressive, heavy with the weight of centuries and whispered prayers. Candles flickered along the walls, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. At the center of the room stood Lucian, the self-appointed leader of the cult of Sythras. His sharp features were illuminated by the soft, orange glow, his voice rising and falling with a fervor that gripped the gathered devotees. "Brothers and sisters," Lucian began, his tone reverent yet commanding, "we gather here tonight, not to plead or beg, but to offer our devotion to the eternal shadow, the one who exists beyond good and evil, the cycle incarnate, Sythras." As his words filled the room, the scene shifted. A cold, empty street. Far from the cathedral, under the pale light of a crescent moon, Sythras moved through the narrow alleyways of the city. His skeletal frame was cloaked in shadow, his movements unnaturally fluid, as though the very darkness around him carried him forward. A faint trail of blood led him to his prey, a man staggering from a bar, unaware of the ancient predator stalking him. The man stumbled, muttering curses into the quiet night. Sythras watched from the shadows, his hollow sockets unblinking as he smelled the blood coursing through the man's veins. "Please," the man slurred to no one in particular. Just leave me alone." Sythras stepped forward, the shadows clinging to him like smoke. The man turned, his drunken bravado melting into pure terror as he looked into the void where Sythras' eyes should have been. "Why?" the man whispered, trembling. Sythras tilted his head slightly, his voice low and detached. "Because I must." "Back in the cathedral," Lucian's voice grew louder, more impassioned. "He is no mere monster, no ordinary predator. Sythras is the balance of all things. For centuries, he has walked among us, unseen and unacknowledged, taking only what he must to survive." The gathered cultists, clad in black robes, bowed their heads in unison. Some whispered prayers, others clutched symbols they believed would bring them closer to their god. "We are the chosen," Lucian continued, his arms outstretched. "We are the few who understand his nature, who accept our place in the cycle. We are prey, yes, but through our devotion, we may become more. Sythras leaned in, his skeletal hand gripping the man's shoulder like a vice. The man struggled weakly, his cries muffled as Sythras' needle-like teeth pierced his neck. The predator fed, draining the life essence from his prey in long, deliberate draws. The man's struggles slowed, then ceased, leaving his lifeless body to crumple to the ground. Sythras straightened, wiping a streak of blood from his lips with the back of his hand. The hunger abated for now, but he felt no satisfaction, no pleasure, only the quiet inevitability of his existence. As he turned to disappear into the shadows once more, a faint smile touched his cracked lips. Lucien's voice softened, taking on a more solemn tone. And so, we offer ourselves to him, not as supplicants, but as willing participants in the eternal cycle. For without the hunter, the prey has no meaning, and without the prey, the hunter has no purpose. The cultists began to chant softly, their voices blending into a haunting melody that echoed through the cathedral. Lucien closed his eyes, basking in their devotion, but even as he spoke of loyalty and purpose, far beyond the cathedral walls, the very subject of their worship moved on, indifferent to their prayers. Sythras had no need for their chants, their offerings, their hollow reverence. He existed not to be admired or feared, but because the cycle demanded it. The shadows of the city embraced him once more as he vanished into the night, leaving behind only silence and a growing ripple of events that would soon reach even the most hidden corners of his world. The hidden lair of Sythras was as lifeless as its occupant, a cavernous space, shrouded in shadows that clung to every surface like smoke. In the dim glow of dozens of monitors, the ancient predator sat in his worn chair, skeletal fingers tapping idly on the armrests. The screens flickered and buzzed, each one displaying a different slice of the world above, a world he had watched for centuries without interruption. Politicians argued on one screen, their voices raised as they shouted over each other about morality, policy, and control. Another monitor showed the aftermath of a battlefield, smoke rising from charred ruins as soldiers marched grimly past the wreckage. A third screen displayed a talk show where hosts debated the nuances of modern relationships, romantic gestures, and fleeting notions of love. Sythras leaned forward, his hollow sockets fixed on the screens. His voice, cold and hollow, echoed softly in the empty space around him. "For centuries," he murmured, "the illusions of life have kept the flock unaware of their true purpose. They believe they act of their own will, yet at every turn their strings are pulled by unseen hands." His head tilted slightly as he watched the screen shift to scenes of smiling couples in movies and advertisements. They watched the fantasy of love, believing it to be sacred, transcendent. But the purpose of such bonds is not glory, it is survival, to reproduce, to continue the flock. He gestured at another screen, where a political debate raged on, candidates pleading for votes and loyalty. They cast their votes, red or blue, left or right, believing they make a difference. Yet the obvious choice, the only choice that frees them, is no colour at all. A faint ripple of disdain crept into his voice as the monitors displayed social media feeds, influencers touting trends, and self-help coaches promoting the approval of others. They crave approval. They shape themselves to be admired, liked, or envied. But approval is nothing more than guilt disguised as virtue, a man-made chain to keep them docile. His hollow sockets lingered on a screen, showing a preacher in a grand cathedral, delivering a fiery sermon about sacrifice and eternal life. Sythras' voice deepened. They are told to sacrifice their lives for causes greater than themselves. promises of eternal glory, or the assurance of a legacy. I have lived forever. It is not glory, it simply is. It is the cycle. Sythras leaned back in his chair, his thin frame consumed by the flickering shadows around him. He paused for a moment, letting the hum of the monitors fill the silence, before continuing. I exist outside the illusions, beyond their petty wars, their fleeting desires, their hollow prayers. I do not show myself. I do not wish to be noticed by their illusions, for if I were... He trailed off, his skeletal hand clenching faintly. They would eventually destroy me. One monitor blinked suddenly, changing to display an image of a leaflet. Sythras' empty gaze focused on the screen as the words came into view. The cult of Sythras. Join us. Serve him. The image showed a crude depiction of him, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes and elongated hands, reaching toward a crowd of kneeling figures. Below it, the text continued. He is the cycle, the eternal balance. Through him, we transcend the illusions of the world. Devote yourself to Sythras and find your true purpose. Sythras tilted his head, his lips curling faintly into a cold, humorless smile. Fools, he muttered. You seek to define that which defies definition. You kneel before me, thinking it will save you from the cycle. But the cycle consumes all, worshippers and hunters alike. His skeletal fingers tapped against the armrest as he studied the leaflet further. A list of promises scrolled beneath the image. Power, immortality, purpose. Each one more absurd than the last. I have no desire for your devotion, Sythras said softly. Your rituals, your prayers, your sacrifices, they mean nothing. I take what I need because I must, not because I care. He reached out and pressed a button, erasing the image from the screen. The other monitors continued their ceaseless display of humanity's illusions. Arguments, wars, desires and lies. For a moment, Sythras sat motionless, a faint glint of something almost like curiosity in his hollow sockets. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. And yet, they speak my name. The shadows around him seemed to deepen as he leaned back in his chair, the faint hum of the monitors filling the silence once more. Somewhere, far above, the wheels of the cycle continued to turn, oblivious to the predator who watched from the darkness below. The predator's nature. The wild is a place of silence and violence, where survival is the only law and the strong prey on the weak. Beneath the pale light of a crescent moon, nature's predators lurk, silent, efficient, and unrelenting. The predator in the forest. In the dense jungle, a panther stalks its prey. Its movements are deliberate, each step a quiet ripple through the undergrowth. Ahead, a lone deer grazes, oblivious to the shadow closing in. The panther's eyes gleam, muscles coiled like springs as it leaps forward. In a heartbeat, the hunt is over. Sharp claws sink into flesh, the deer's muffled cry fading into the night. Far from the jungle, in the heart of a sleeping city, Sythras mirrors this scene. A young woman walks briskly down a dimly lit street, her headphones blocking out the world around her. Sythras watches from the shadows, his skeletal frame cloaked in darkness. Her scent reaches him, a faint, intoxicating mixture of fear and life. He steps forward, silent as a whisper, until he is right behind her. She turns, sensing the unnatural presence too late. Her eyes widen as Sythras strikes, his long fingers clamping over her mouth to stifle her scream. His needle-like teeth sink into her neck, drawing the life from her. Her body spasms, then goes limp, crumpling to the ground as he steps back. His hollow sockets betray no emotion, no satisfaction. He feeds because he must. The predator of the sky. In the vast plains, a hawk soars high above its territory. With unerring precision, it spots a rabbit, scurrying between the rocks below. Wings tucked, the hawk dives, its talons extended. The rabbit has no chance. Its struggle is brief, its purpose fulfilled in the cycle. Sythras' next prey is a middle-aged man, leaving his office late at night. The man carries a briefcase, his shoulders slumped in exhaustion. He stops under a flickering streetlight, fumbling for his keys, unaware of the shadow that looms above him. Sythras descends like the hawk, his skeletal hands gripping the man's shoulders. The briefcase drops, spilling papers onto the pavement. The man gasps, his protest silenced as Sythras tilts his head, needle-like teeth piercing the flesh of his throat. The light flickers again, and when it steadies, the man lies lifeless on the ground, the predator of the water. In the depths of a murky river, a crocodile lies in wait. Its eyes peek just above the water's surface, unblinking, as it watches an antelope drink from the riverbank. With terrifying speed it strikes, its jaws clamping down with brutal efficiency. The antelope struggles briefly before being dragged beneath the surface. The water ripples, then stills, as though nothing had happened. In a shadowed alley, Sythras moves with the same quiet inevitability. A young man, dressed in a hoodie, counts cash from a small deal. His confidence is palpable. He feels untouchable in his familiar territory. Sythras emerges from the shadows, his hollow sockets fixed on the man. There is no warning, no exchange of words. He strikes with the precision of the crocodile, his hands gripping the man's head as he drains him of life. The cash flutters to the ground, forgotten. The alley grows silent once more. The predator's nature. Sythras steps back into the shadows, leaving his latest victim crumpled in the darkness. His skeletal frame is neither hunched nor triumphant. There is no glory in the hunt, no malice in the kill. His voice, soft and hollow, carries into the emptiness. The lion takes the gazelle without thought, its claws cutting deep into muscle and bone. The spider spins its web, trapping its prey with threads as thin as air. The hawk dives, the crocodile strikes. None act with cruelty, none with kindness. He tilts his head slightly, the faint glimmer of a streetlight catching the sharp edges of his needle-like teeth. I am no different. I take what I must, for I too exist within the cycle. My prey is not chosen, it simply is. The moonlight filters weakly through the clouds, casting long shadows across the sleeping city. Sythras melts into them, his presence disappearing as easily as it arrived. Somewhere, another predator moves in the wild, fulfilling its role, and like them, Sythras continues his hunt, driven by the same law that governs all living things: survival. The faint hum of the city's distant life faded as Sythras slipped into his hidden lair, a shadow among shadows. His skeletal frame moved soundlessly through the vast underground space. The dim lights flickered erratically, their weak glow reflecting off the cold concrete walls. The power source, tapped discreetly from the city above, was another act of survival. Another thread in the intricate web Sythras wove to remain unnoticed. Deep within the lair, Sythras settled into his chair, the monitors before him flickering to life with images of the city's constant chaos. For a moment, the predator rested, though his existence was never truly at peace. The hunters in the distance, far above the lair, a group of figures crouched in the shadows of a crumbling rooftop. Their leader, Hale, peered through binoculars, tracking Sythras' every movement as he entered the lair. "This is it," Hale muttered, lowering the binoculars. The rumors were true. The cult wasn't lying. Another hunter, a wiry man named Quinn, shifted uneasily. "We don't even know what he is. Are we sure we're ready for this?" Hale smirked. "We're not here to fight him yet. First, we gather more intel. We'll break the cult, squeeze them for everything they know, and then we'll come back prepared." The group disappeared into the night, their sights set on the cult of Sythras. The sanctuary of the cult of Sythras, hidden in an abandoned building, was eerily quiet. Candles flickered as the remaining members whispered prayers to their unseen god. Lucian, their leader, stood at the altar, his voice rising in fervor, but the prayers were interrupted by the sound of shattering glass. The hunters stormed in, their weapons raised, silenced gunfire cutting through the chanting. Panic erupted as cultists fled in every direction. "Where is he?" Hale shouted, grabbing Lucian by the collar. Lucian spat blood, his lips curling in defiance. "You think you can kill a god?" Hale's gun answered, and Lucian fell lifeless to the ground. One by one, the cultists were silenced, their sacred space defiled by violence. Amid the chaos, Naomi, a young and devoted member, slipped into the shadows and fled into the night, clutching a small pendant of Sythras in her trembling hands. Naomi ran through the city streets, her breath ragged. The hunters had destroyed everything, her only sanctuary reduced to ashes. The rumors of Sythras' lair, whispered among the cult, were her only hope now. She found the hidden entrance and slipped inside, her footsteps echoing faintly in the vast tunnels. The air was damp and cold, the faint hum of stolen electricity the only sound. Flickering lights cast long shadows, and the walls seemed to close in as she ventured deeper. "Master," Naomi whispered, her voice trembling. The silence pressed against her like a weight. Something moved in the darkness. Her heart pounded as she turned sharply, feeling unseen eyes on her. "Master, please?" she called again, clutching her pendant. The shadows shifted, coiling unnaturally. A shape emerged, tall and skeletal, its presence suffocating. Sythras stepped into the dim light, his hollow sockets fixed on her trembling form. Naomi fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Master, forgive me for intruding. They've betrayed you. The hunters, they know your location. Ren sold us out." Sythras tilted his head slightly, his voice cold and detached. "Betrayal implies devotion. I care for neither. There is no room for such illusions in the cycle." "They will come for you," Naomi cried. "They know where you are." Sythras' expression did not change. "Let them. They will walk willingly into the web of the deadliest spider. I hunger." Naomi stared at him, desperation in her eyes. "Ren betrayed us. He sold you out for his own greed. Punish him, I beg you." Sythras' hollow sockets seemed to pierce her very soul. "What difference does it make? Betrayal is as meaningless as devotion. Both are constructs of the illusions you cling to. I exist beyond them." Naomi's voice broke as she spoke, her tears falling freely. "You are exactly what I believe. You are the truth, the master, the savior, the only one who stands outside the lies." She held out her arms. "Take my life. I no longer wish to serve the illusions. Take me and punish Ren." Sythras moved closer, his skeletal hand reaching out to tilt her chin upward. His hollow voice resonated softly. "You offer your life willingly, a rare act among your kind." Naomi closed her eyes, her voice steady despite her trembling frame. "For you, master, always." Sythras leaned in, his needle-like teeth piercing her neck. Her body tensed, then slackened as he fed, taking her life essence. Through her blood, he saw it all. The hunters, Ren's betrayal, the slaughter of the cult. When he finished, Sythras straightened, his voice low and cold. "Ren will not escape the cycle. The spider does not forget the fly that shakes its web." Naomi's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, her face serene. Sythras stepped back into the shadows, his hollow sockets gleaming faintly as he spoke to the empty lair. "Let them come, for Sythras hungers." The cult's sanctuary was a ruin, its halls smeared with blood and echoes of violence. The hunters moved methodically through the carnage, stepping over bodies as they gathered any scraps of information left behind. Maps, notes, fragments of rituals. Everything they could find was carefully documented. "Looks like they worshipped him," one of the hunters, Quinn, muttered, flipping through a blood-stained notebook. "They called him a god." Hale, their leader, stood over the altar, his sharp gaze scanning the surroundings. "God or not, he's just another predator," he said, his voice cold. "We've killed plenty like him." Another hunter, a woman named Brooks, scoffed. "An old vampire hiding in the shadows. This one's going to be easy." Hale's jaw tightened as he turned to his team. "Don't get cocky. This one's different. If half of what these cultists believed is true, we're not dealing with an ordinary bloodsucker. Stay sharp." The lair of Sythras. The hunters followed the trail to a decrepit old house on the edge of the city. Its exterior was weathered and unassuming, a forgotten relic of another time. But beneath the house lay something far older, a labyrinth of tunnels stretching deep into the earth. The team breached the entrance, their night vision goggles illuminating the way as they descended into the darkness. The air grew colder, damp with the scent of decay, and the faint hum of stolen electricity vibrated through the walls. "This place is a maze," Brooks muttered, her voice crackling through their comms. "Stay close," Hale ordered. "We stick to the plan. We sweep, locate, and neutralize." The team advanced, their silent weaponry at the ready, their movements calculated and precise. Despite their training, an uneasy tension settled over them as they delved deeper. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows shifting unnaturally, as though they had a life of their own. From the darkness, Sythras watched, his skeletal frame blended seamlessly with the shadows, his hollow sockets fixed on the intruders. Their advanced gear and confident strides meant nothing to him. They were insects, oblivious to the web they had entered. The first mistake came when Brooks strayed slightly from the group, her attention caught by a flickering light down a side tunnel. She turned, her weapon raised, but the tunnel was empty. "Brooks, report." Hale's voice crackled in her earpiece. "I thought I saw." Her voice cut off, replaced by a sharp gasp. The team spun toward her location, but all they found was her night vision goggles, cracked and lying in a pool of blood. "Eyes up!" Hale barked. "He's here." The hunters moved more cautiously now, their banter replaced by tense silence. The tunnels stretched endlessly in every direction, twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. The sound of dripping water echoed, mingling with the faint hum of power coursing through the lair. Quinn froze, his eyes darting toward a faint movement in the shadows. "Something's there," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Hold your position," Hale ordered, his weapon sweeping the darkness. Before Quinn could respond, a blur of shadow moved behind him. He screamed, his voice cut short as a skeletal hand clamped over his mouth. Sythras' needle-like teeth pierced his neck, draining him silently before the lifeless body slumped to the ground. Hale and the remaining hunters spun around, their weapons firing into the void. The shadows swallowed the noise. The tunnels seemed to mock them, their echoing gunfire revealing nothing. As the team pressed deeper into the lair, their formation broke down. The labyrinth played tricks on their senses, each tunnel seeming to loop back on itself. Panic began to seep into their movements, their once coordinated steps now hurried and erratic. "We're being hunted," One of them muttered, his voice trembling. Hale clenched his jaw. "Stay together. We're not prey. We're the hunters." But the truth was evident. The team, with all their advanced training and equipment, was no match for the ancient predator that stalked them. Sythras moved like a shadow, silent and unrelenting, his skeletal frame a blur in the darkness. One by one he picked them off, each attack swift and merciless. The tunnels became a graveyard of discarded gear and lifeless bodies, their advanced technology useless against the force that hunted them. The last stand. Hale, the last remaining hunter, stumbled into a central chamber. The room was vast, its walls lined with old machinery, humming faintly with stolen power. The flickering lights cast long, jagged shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. He raised his weapon, his breath ragged. "Come on," he growled, his voice shaking. "Face me." The shadows coalesced, and Sythras stepped forward, his skeletal frame towering over Hale, his hollow sockets fixed on the hunter, his expression as empty as the void. "You entered my web," Sythras said, his voice cold and detached. "And like all who do, you will feed it." Hale fired, but the bullets passed through empty air as Sythras vanished into the shadows. A hand gripped his shoulder from behind, and he froze, the predator's voice a whisper in his ear. "You are not the hunter," Sythras said. "You are the prey." The darkness consumed him, his screams echoing through the labyrinth as Sythras fed once more. The lair fell silent, the cycle continuing as it always had. Sythras stepped back into the shadows, his hunger sated. For now, the faint hum of the monitors filled Sythras's lair, their flickering glow the only source of light in the vast, darkened space. The screens displayed scenes of chaos from the world above, violence, scandal, and confusion woven into the fabric of humanity's endless narrative. On one screen, the breaking news reported the discovery of the cult's hideout. A polished news anchor spoke in hushed tones about gang violence in the city, hinting at strange rituals and whispered rumors of deities worshipped by an underground sect. "This city grows darker by the day," the anchor said, as footage of the destroyed sanctuary played. Sythras sat unmoving, his skeletal fingers resting on the armrests of his chair. His hollow sockets were fixed on the screens, his voice soft and detached. "For centuries I have watched," he murmured. "I have seen their illusions take form and grow stronger. They control the flock, through shadows of their own making, webs spun from fear, desire, and promises they will never keep." He leaned forward, his hollow sockets seeming to darken. "These illusions are powerful enough to destroy even me. They rule through belief, through faith in things unseen. I remain hidden, for even a shadow must fear the light." Far from the lair, in the dimly lit lobby of an airport hotel, Wren approached the front desk. His demeanor was calm, almost smug, as he handed over his identification and retrieved his room key. "Just one night," he said, his voice steady. "I've got an early flight." With his plane ticket tucked neatly into the front pocket of his jacket and a small suitcase in hand, Wren made his way to his room. He locked the door behind him, double-checking the chain. His confidence was palpable. He believed he had escaped the consequences of his betrayal. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Wren opened a bottle of whiskey from the minibar and poured himself a drink. He raised the glass in a silent toast to himself, a smirk playing on his lips. "Here's to survival," he muttered, downing the drink in one gulp. Night fell over the hotel, the corridors quiet and still. Wren lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his suitcase packed and ready by the door. The room's small desk lamp flickered faintly, the bulb buzzing louder with each passing second. Suddenly, the light grew unnaturally bright, flooding the room with a harsh, glaring glow before the bulb popped, plunging the space into darkness. Ren sat up, his breath quickening. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaking. From the far corner of the room, the shadows began to thicken, coalescing into a form that seemed to drain the air of warmth. Ren scrambled backward, pressing himself against the headboard as the figure of Sythras emerged from the darkness. "No, no," Ren stammered, his voice rising to a scream. "Please, I didn't mean..." Sythras stepped forward, his skeletal frame towering over Ren. His hollow sockets seemed to pierce through the man's very soul. "Naomi has paid the price," Sythras said, his voice cold and hollow. "I now deliver." Ren's trembling hands shot up in a feeble attempt to shield himself. "It wasn't personal. I didn't mean to..." Sythras tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. "I care little for your betrayal, for your greed. It matters not to me. Why should a lion care what the gazelle eats? But my servant has paid, and so it is time to deliver." Before Ren could plead further, Sythras moved with terrifying speed, his skeletal hands gripping Ren's throat as his needle-like teeth pierced the man's neck. Ren's screams choked into silence as the life drained from his body, leaving him a crumpled, lifeless form on the bed. Sythras straightened, his skeletal hand brushing a drop of blood from his lips. Without a word, he stepped back into the shadows, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Back in his lair, Sythras sat once more before his monitors. The screens flickered with scenes of chaos and illusion. Wars waged for power, false prophets promising salvation, and a society devouring itself in the name of progress. He leaned back in his chair, his hollow sockets fixed on the images. "The cycle continues," he murmured, his voice a faint echo in the empty room. "It always does. The prey runs, the predator hunts, the balance remains." The lair fell silent, save for the hum of the monitors. Sythras waited, as he always had, for the cycle to repeat once more, for though he cared for nothing, he was bound to it all. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeps through layers and gnaws at the bone. The streets were alive with flickering neon lights. But here, in the alleys where shadows reigned, the world was silent. Sythras moved through the darkness like a ripple on water, his skeletal frame blending seamlessly into the shadows. His hollow sockets scanned the streets, unblinking, as he searched for his next prey. The faint scent of blood lingered in the air, a sign of life, of vitality, and of the cycle that bound him to the world. A man emerged from a corner bar, his steps unsteady, and his breath visible in the icy air. He was alone, muttering curses to himself as he fumbled with his keys. Oblivious to the predator lurking nearby, he staggered into an alleyway, the perfect place for shadows to devour the light. Sythras watched, silent and patient, as the man stumbled deeper into the darkness. There was no malice in his movements, no emotion in his empty gaze. He was not a killer driven by hate or cruelty. He was simply the embodiment of nature's unrelenting hunger. The man froze, a flicker of instinct sparking through his fogged mind. He turned slowly, his eyes darting into the black void around him. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The shadows shifted, coiling unnaturally as Sythras stepped forward. The man's breath hitched as he caught sight of the figure emerging from the darkness. Tall, skeletal, with a face that seemed more a memory of humanity than anything alive. "Please," the man stammered, dropping his keys. I have a family. Don't..." Sythras tilted his head, his hollow sockets fixed on the man. His voice was low, devoid of empathy. "The lion does not spare the gazelle for its young. The cycle cares for nothing but itself." The man screamed as Sythras lunged, his needle-like teeth sinking into the man's neck. The scream faded to a gurgle, and then to silence, as Sythras drained the life from his prey. The man's body crumpled to the ground, lifeless, as Sythras straightened. The predator stepped back into the shadows, leaving no trace but the empty shell of his victim. The hunt was over. The cycle continued. The apartment was small, cluttered with mismatched furniture and the smell of old coffee. The television blared in the background, muted images of a newscaster reporting on a surge of unexplained deaths in the city. Evan sat on the floor, his hands trembling as he stared at the photo in his lap. It was a picture of his mother, smiling brightly as she held his hand on a long-forgotten summer day. Her warmth, her laughter, everything about her had been ripped away in an instant. He hadn't found her body. The police had told him it was an animal attack, something savage and unexplainable. But Evan had seen the footage from the alleyway cameras. He had seen the shadowy figure that took her, leaving behind only a lifeless husk. Tears streamed down his face, his breathing ragged, his grief twisted into something sharper, something darker. "I'll find you," Evan whispered, his voice shaking but resolute. Whatever you are, I'll make you pay." He clenched the photo in his hands, his jaw tightening as his sorrow turned to rage. The predator had taken everything from him, and Evan swore he would hunt it down, even if it meant becoming prey himself. In the dark streets outside, the shadows lingered, silent and watchful, and somewhere deep within them, Sythras moved, unaware that his cycle of survival had sparked the flames of vengeance in yet another broken soul. Evan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the flickering light of his phone. The email he'd received an hour ago glowed on the screen, its subject line cryptic, yet impossible to ignore. "Answers await. Tonight, 11 p.m, Warehouse 12, Docks." The sender was anonymous, the body of the email just as vague. "You're not alone. We know what took your mother. Join us." Evan's heart pounded as he reread the words. His gut told him this could be a trap, or worse, a cruel joke. But his grief, his anger and his desperation gnawed at him. He couldn't ignore it. He needed answers. The docks were deserted at this hour, the air thick with the scent of salt water and decay. Evan pulled his jacket tighter around him as he approached the rusted doors of Warehouse 12. Inside, the space was dimly lit, the hum of old fluorescent lights echoing off the steel walls. A group of figures stood near a makeshift table in the center of the room. As Evan approached, their voices hushed and all eyes turned to him. The leader, a woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, stepped forward. "You must be Evan," she said. "I'm Margaret." Evan hesitated, his fists clenched. "Who are you? Why am I here?" Margaret gestured to the others. "We're like you. We've all lost someone to that thing." Her voice faltered briefly, but her resolve remained. "We've all felt the same rage, the same helplessness. But together, we're going to stop it." Evan took a step back, his voice rising. "Stop it. You don't even know what it is. You think you can just..." "It killed my daughter," Margaret interrupted, her tone sharp. The room fell silent as she continued. "That thing tore her away from me, just like it did to your mother, and I'm not going to sit back and let it keep hunting. are you? Evan's anger flared. I don't know who you people are, but I don't need your help. I'll handle this on my own. A tall, wiry man stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. My name's Caleb. I lost my brother to it 5 years ago. We were close. He was the only family I had left. The police said it was an animal attack, but I found the footage. I saw it. That thing didn't just kill him, it drained the life out of him. Another voice chimed in, this one softer, but no less resolute. I'm Daniela, said a woman with a scar running across her cheek. I served in the military. I've seen war, but I've never seen anything like that thing. It took my husband. One moment he was walking home from work, the next, I'm identifying his body in the morgue. I want revenge, and I'm not stopping until I get it. The final member, a young woman named Clara, stepped forward. My little brother, she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. He was only 12. I promised to protect him, and I failed. I can't bring him back, but I can make sure that monster pays. Evan's breath hitched as he listened to their stories, each one a mirror of his own pain. The rage he had tried to keep contained surged to the surface, and his hands shook as he clenched them into fists. You think you can kill it? He asked, his voice raw with anger and doubt. Margaret stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. We've studied it. We know its patterns, its habits. Alone we're nothing, but together we stand a chance. This is your chance, Evan. A chance for revenge. Evan's jaw tightened as he stared at the faces around him. Their pain was palpable, their determination infectious. For a moment, his mother's face flashed in his mind, her laughter echoing in his memory. Fine, he said, his voice low and steady. I'm in. But if we're doing this, we're going all the way. That thing doesn't get to keep doing this. Margaret nodded, a faint smile breaking through her hardened expression. Welcome to the hunt. In the dim light of the warehouse, the group's shared pain bound them together. Unbeknownst to them, the predator they sought already knew of their presence. For Sythras, the hunt had already begun. The air in the warehouse was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above. The group gathered around a rickety table piled high with books, yellowed papers, and digital devices. Margaret stood at the head, her presence commanding as she gestured to the materials. Everything we've found, she began, paints a picture of something ancient, something that's been here far longer than we can imagine. Evan crossed his arms, skepticism still tugging at him. So what are we saying here? That this thing has been killing people for centuries, and no one's managed to stop it? Margaret nodded grimly. That's exactly what we're saying. The records. Caleb tapped on his laptop, pulling up grainy scans of old police reports and coroner records. The earliest verified cases we have are from the late 19th century, a string of unexplained deaths in small towns, victims drained of blood, no signs of struggle. He scrolled through the files, showing images of faded documents and black and white photographs. It was written off as some kind of illness or freak accidents, but the pattern is there. It moves from town to town, leaving behind just enough to fuel rumors, but not enough to draw real attention. Daniela leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she slid a battered journal across the table. This one's older, early 1700s, a merchant's personal diary. He talks about a shadow of death stalking his village, claims it killed his wife and child before vanishing into the night. She flipped to a page with a crude, ink-drawn figure, a tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes. He called it a demon, said it had no mercy, no soul. Older records. Clara hesitated before adding her contribution, a dusty, leather-bound book with brittle pages. This is from the late 1500s. I got it from an antique dealer who said it came from a monastery. She opened it carefully, revealing faded Latin script and eerie illustrations. One showed a skeletal figure, draped in shadows, surrounded by terrified villagers. Beneath it, the word mortis incarnatus, death incarnate. The monks thought it was some kind of punishment from God, Clara explained. They believed it was sent to cull the wicked, but it didn't discriminate. Men, women, children, it killed them all. Evan shifted uncomfortably. So it's been around for hundreds of years. That's terrifying, sure, but it's just a vampire, right? It's not invincible. The oldest tale. Margaret stepped forward, setting a thick binder on the table. You think hundreds of years is bad? Try going back to the earliest days of recorded history. The group stared as she opened the binder, revealing photocopies of early medieval manuscripts and fragments of oral traditions written down by scribes. One illustration depicted a skeletal figure draped in shadows, surrounded by crude, terrified figures kneeling before it. Below the image were the words, Umbra Aeternus, the eternal shadow. This, Margaret said, her voice steady, comes from the records of a forgotten kingdom that existed just before the rise of modern empires. It's one of the earliest written accounts we could find. The people of that time didn't have a name for what we'd call a vampire. They thought it was a demon or even a god of death. She flipped to another page, showing a translated fragment of an ancient text. It moves in darkness, unseen and unchallenged. Neither man nor beast. It feeds eternally, untouched by time, the bringer of silence. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Margaret's voice grew quieter, heavier. They say it stalked villages, preying on the weak and vulnerable. They believed sacrifices would appease it, but it didn't stop. It never stops. Evan swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on him. How many people do you think it's killed? Margaret sighed, her eyes meeting his. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. The decision. Evan broke the silence, his voice low. If this thing's been around that long, why hasn't anyone stopped it? Margaret met his gaze, her expression grim. Because no one's been prepared. People wrote it off as legend, superstition. It kept moving, hiding, surviving. But now we know what it is. We know how it hunts. And we're not going to let it continue. Daniela nodded. This isn't just about revenge anymore. It's about ending something that's existed for far too long. Caleb added, We've seen enough. We know what we're up against. It's not human, but it's not invincible. We just have to figure out how to stop it. Margaret closed the binder, her expression hard. We're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone who's been taken, for everyone who will be, if we don't act. Evan stared at the table, his fists clenched. The image of his mother's face burned in his mind. Then we end it, he said, his voice resolute. We end Sythras. Around the table, the group nodded in agreement. Unbeknownst to them, the predator they sought was already watching, his hollow sockets ever vigilant, his hunger ever growing. The city was alive with its usual hum, blaring car horns, distant sirens, and the muffled chatter of countless voices. But in the shadowed alleys and forgotten corners, the true predator roamed. Sythras moved silently through the darkness, his skeletal frame blending seamlessly into the shadows. To the world above, he was unseen, unknown, but to those he chose as prey, he was a nightmare incarnate. His hollow sockets scanned the streets with cold detachment, seeking the faintest flicker of life that would sustain him. He stopped at the edge of an alley, watching as a lone woman walked briskly, her coat pulled tight against the cold. She was unaware of the figure lurking in the dark, a figure that had hunted her kind for centuries, untethered by morality or time. The sound of weeping filled the air, mingling with the rancid stench of death. The village was dying, consumed by a plague no healer could cure. Families burned their dead, their faces hollow with despair. And in the darkest hour of the night, Sythras hunted. He moved through the village like a shadow, his presence unnoticed amidst the chaos. A frail man knelt by his wife's body, whispering desperate prayers. Sythras stepped from the shadows, his skeletal form towering over the grieving man. "Please," the man begged, his voice trembling. "Spare me. I have nothing left." Sythras tilted his head, his hollow sockets unblinking. "Even in your despair you breathe. That is enough." With terrifying speed, Sythras descended upon him, draining the last of his life. The man slumped lifelessly beside his wife, the cycle of survival continuing as it always had. Present day, the city hunt. The woman paused, sensing something behind her. She turned, peering into the alleyway's darkness, but saw nothing. Her pace quickened, her breath visible in the cold night air. Sythras followed, silent and deliberate. He could hear her heartbeat, smell the faint metallic tang of her blood. The predator in him stirred, an eternal hunger driving him forward. The French Revolution. The streets of Paris were drenched in blood, the guillotine's blade glinting in the sunlight. Revolutionaries chanted in triumph as the heads of nobles rolled into baskets. Amid the chaos, Sythras thrived. The screams of the condemned and the stench of death masked his presence as he hunted among the frightened crowds. A young aristocrat, desperate to escape, darted into a darkened alley. Sythras stepped into his path, his skeletal visage illuminated by the flicker of a distant torch. The boy stumbled backward, trembling. "You think the blade is cruel," Sythras said, his voice a cold whisper, "but it is mercy compared to me." The boy's screams were swallowed by the night as Sythras fed, his hunger unending. The woman reached the entrance of her apartment building, fumbling with her keys. Her breath quickened, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't see him until it was too late. Sythras emerged from the shadows, his skeletal frame towering over her. She froze, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Don't hurt me." Sythras tilted his head, his hollow sockets unblinking. The gazelle pleads with the lion. The mouse trembles before the hawk, and yet the cycle remains. With inhuman speed, he struck. Her screams echoed briefly in the empty street before fading into silence. Her lifeless body crumpled to the ground as Sythras stood, his hunger momentarily sated. Bombs fell from the sky, turning cities into rubble and fire. Amid the chaos of war, humanity's suffering masked Sythras's presence once more. In the ruins of a bombed-out home, a soldier limped through the debris, blood dripping from a wound on his leg. He stopped to catch his breath, unaware of the shadow stalking him. Sythras stepped from the darkness, his skeletal form illuminated by the flickering light of a distant fire. The soldier raised his weapon, his hands shaking. "You are not my enemy," Sythras said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You are simply my prey." The soldier fired, but the bullets passed through empty air as Sythras closed the distance between them. In moments, the predator fed, the cycle continuing amidst the destruction of war. Present day, the cycle continues. Sythras stood over the woman's lifeless body, his hollow sockets fixed on the city lights in the distance. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only the quiet stillness that came with survival. The centuries had changed nothing. Humanity built its illusions of safety, of power, of control, but in the end, they were still prey, and he was still the predator. "The cycle continues," Sythras murmured, his voice a faint echo in the night. He disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only silence and the faint scent of death. The warehouse was dimly lit, the flickering overhead lights casting long shadows across the room. The group sat around the battered table, a mix of determination and tension written across their faces. Maps, photographs, and notes cluttered the surface, evidence of countless hours spent obsessing over their target. Margaret stood at the head of the table, her arms crossed as she surveyed the group. "We've done the research," she said firmly. "Now it's time to act." Caleb, sitting closest to the maps, tapped a finger on one of the photographs. "This is the address," he said, pointing to a grainy image of an old decrepit building. "I got it from a source in the cult before the hunters wiped them out. They claimed this was one of Sythras' hideouts." The evidence. Daniela leaned in, her military instincts kicking in. "How sure are we about this? We can't afford to waste time chasing ghosts." Caleb hesitated before pulling out his phone. "I've been staking it out for weeks. I haven't seen much, but I managed to capture this." He swiped to a video and set the phone on the table. The screen showed a shadowy figure moving through the darkness toward the building's entrance. Its gait was unnervingly smooth, its form shrouded in an unnatural darkness that seemed to consume the faint light around it. "That's him," Caleb said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm not 100%, but if it's not him, it's something just as bad." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Evan broke the silence, his fists clenched. "It's him," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "It has to be. We can't let this chance slip away." Margaret nodded, her expression hard. "If we're going, we need to be prepared. This isn't like anything we've faced before. We can't rely on what we think we know about vampires. We have to cover every possibility." Daniela stood, opening a large duffel bag she had brought. Silver stakes, crosses, garlic, classic stuff. But I've also got more modern options. She pulled out a set of compact crossbows, UV flashlights, and small incendiary devices. Caleb added, "I've rigged some of these with UV emitting bulbs. If he's really as sensitive to light as we think, these could buy us some time." Clara picked up a vial of holy water, turning it over in her hands. "Do we even know if any of this will work? What if he's beyond all of it?" Margaret placed a steady hand on Clara's shoulder. "We use everything we've got. If one thing doesn't work, we move to the next. No hesitation." Caleb spread a blueprint of the building across the table. "Here's the layout. It's an old site, abandoned for years. The entrance is here," he said, pointing to the main door. "But there's also a back entrance and a series of tunnels underneath. That's where he's likely hiding." Daniela traced the paths with her finger. "We'll need to cover all the exits. He's not just going to sit there and let us come to him." Margaret nodded. "We'll split into 2 teams. One group covers the main entrance, the other the tunnels. Caleb, you're on tech. Monitor the entrances and keep us updated. Everyone else, we move fast and strike hard. We can't give him time to counter." Evan, silent until now, finally spoke. "And if it goes wrong?" Margaret's gaze hardened. "Then we fight like hell. No one backs down." The group gathered their equipment, checking and rechecking their gear. Crossbows were loaded, UV flashlights tested, and stakes tucked into holsters. The air was thick with a mix of fear and determination. Margaret slung a crossbow over her shoulder, her voice firm. "This is it. Whatever happens, we end this tonight." Evan looked at the photograph of the shadowy figure one last time before tucking it into his pocket. His jaw tightened as he whispered, "For Mom." One by one, the group exited the warehouse, their vehicles rumbling to life in the cold night. They drove in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, as the city lights blurred past. Ahead of them, the old site loomed in the distance, its broken windows and crumbling walls a stark reminder of the danger they faced. Unbeknownst to them, Sythras was already aware of their presence, his hollow sockets watching from the shadows. For the predator, this was just another hunt. For the prey, it was a fight for survival. The cycle was about to turn once more. The old house stood like a relic of forgotten times, its windows shattered and walls cloaked in ivy. The moonlight barely illuminated its crumbling facade, casting jagged shadows that seemed to reach out like claws. The group stepped out of their vehicles, their breaths visible in the chill night air. Margaret, crossbow in hand, signaled for silence as they approached the decrepit entrance. "This is it," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. Margaret nodded. "Stay focused. Remember the plan." Unbeknownst to them, another figure lurked in the distance, small and hunched, cloaked in darkness. Its eyes glinted faintly in the moonlight as it watched the group disappear into the house, slipping into the shadows behind them. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The group moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, revealing graffiti-stained walls and discarded debris. "Stairs," Daniela whispered, gesturing to a narrow stone staircase leading downward. They descended into the tunnels, their footsteps echoing unnervingly. The air grew colder, and the silence became oppressive, broken only by the distant drip of water. "This place is ancient," Clara muttered, running her fingers along the damp stone walls. Evan kept his weapon raised, his eyes darting at every flicker of shadow. "Feels like a tomb." Unseen by the group, Sythras moved silently through the tunnels, his form blending seamlessly with the shadows. He watched them with hollow indifference, like a predator observing prey, not out of hunger, but out of habit. He had already fed tonight. There was no urgency, no primal need driving him. To him, this was little more than a game, a way to pass the time in his eternal existence. The group's flashlights occasionally caught fleeting glimpses of movement, shadows shifting unnaturally, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. "Did you see that?" Caleb whispered, his voice shaking. "See what?" Margaret asked, scanning the darkness. "Something. There, in the shadows." Margaret tightened her grip on her crossbow. "Stay sharp. Don't let your guard down." Realizing the hunt, as they pressed deeper into the labyrinth, the tunnels began to twist and turn, each path looking the same as the last. "Wait," Daniela said, stopping abruptly. "Didn't we pass this way already?" "No," Caleb argued. "We haven't." "We have," Clara snapped, her voice rising. "We're going in circles." Margaret cut them off. "Enough! We stick to the plan." A faint sound echoed through the tunnels, a soft, deliberate scraping that sent shivers down their spines. "What the hell was that?" Evan whispered, his weapon shaking in his hands. "We're being hunted," Margaret said grimly. The group huddled closer together, their flashlights darting in every direction. The scraping sound grew louder, more deliberate, echoing all around them. They stumbled into a larger chamber, the ceiling high and the walls slick with moisture. The space felt oppressive, as if the darkness itself was alive and pressing in on them. "Where are we?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb scanned the room, his flashlight trembling. "This isn't on the map." Tension flared as the group began to argue. "You got us lost," Daniela hissed at Caleb. "I was following the damn plan," he snapped back. "Stop it!" Margaret barked. but the group's fear had already fractured their unity. The sound of scraping ceased, replaced by a deafening silence, and then, from the farthest corner of the room, a figure emerged. Sythras stepped into the faint light, his skeletal frame towering over the group. His hollow sockets seemed to pierce their very souls, and the darkness around him moved unnaturally, like tendrils of shadow writhing at his command. Margaret raised her crossbow. "Now!" she shouted. The group unleashed their weapons, bolts of silver, UV lights, and vials of holy water, all aimed at the predator. Sythras didn't move. The attack struck him, only to dissipate into the shadows as if he were made of smoke. He tilted his head, the faintest hint of boredom in his expression. "Is this all?" he asked, his voice cold and hollow. "Do you truly believe your illusions can harm me?" Evan fired his crossbow in desperation, the bolt sailing through Sythras' chest and embedding in the wall behind him. The predator took a slow step forward, unfazed. "You are not hunters," he said, his tone devoid of malice. "You are insects, lost and flailing in the dark." The group froze, their weapons useless, their courage shattered. As Sythras loomed over them, his skeletal hand reaching forward, the reality of their helplessness sank in. They were nothing more than prey, trapped in the web of the deadliest predator. The room was silent, save for the sound of their ragged breaths as the shadows closed in. Sythras loomed over his prey, his skeletal form blending into the oppressive shadows of the chamber. The group cowered beneath him, their weapons discarded, their courage shattered. His hollow sockets gazed down at them, devoid of malice, yet filled with the inevitability of their doom. As his skeletal hand reached toward Margaret, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Stop!" The sound echoed through the chamber, halting Sythras mid-motion. From the farthest corner of the room, another figure emerged, a smaller shadow stepping into the faint light. Ella. Sythras turned his head, tilting it slightly in acknowledgement, as if another predator had joined the hunt. "Ella," he said, his voice calm, emotionless. The group stared in confusion as the young woman, pale and ethereal, approached. Her eyes glowed faintly, her presence commanding despite her small stature. "This is not the cycle," Ella said firmly, her gaze locked on Sythras. Sythras regarded her with faint curiosity. "The cycle is not yours to dictate," he replied. "They entered my web. The fly does not choose when it is caught." Ella's plea. Ella stepped closer, placing herself between Sythras and the trembling group. "The cycle has been sated," she said. "You have fed. These people are not part of the balance. They are anomalies, fleeting deviations in the eternal change." Sythras tilted his head, his hollow sockets narrowing slightly. "The fly's reasons are irrelevant. It landed in my web. Its struggle is meaningless." Ella took a deep breath, her voice softening but remaining resolute. "They are blind, Sythras. Blind to the illusions they cling to. Blind to the cycle you serve. Destroying them would not strengthen the balance. It would weaken it." Sythras paused, his hand hovering in the air. "You plead for them, knowing they would see me destroyed. Why?" She stepped closer still, her voice unwavering. "Because they do not understand. Because their fear blinds them to the truth of the cycle. And because you taught me to see beyond the illusions." A faint, almost imperceptible smile crossed Sythras' skeletal visage. "You have grown, Ella. You see the web, and yet you walk its strands unbroken. I chose well when I made you." The group stared in stunned silence as the towering predator straightened, his hollow sockets scanning them one final time. "If they remain in my web when I hunger again," Sythras said, his voice low and chilling, "the story story will end differently." With that, he melted into the shadows, his form dissolving into the darkness, as though he had never been there. Ella's warning. Ella turned to the group, her expression unreadable. Margaret, her voice trembling, managed to stammer, Why did he let us go?" Ella's gaze softened slightly. "Sythras is not what you think. He is not cruel, nor is he merciful. He simply is. He takes no joy in death, but he also has no sorrow for it. He feeds because the cycle demands it. No more, no less." Evan clenched his fists, anger bubbling to the surface. "He killed my mother," he growled. "He's killed thousands. How can you defend him?" Ella's eyes locked onto his. "I do not defend him. I explain him. Sythras is as death itself, inevitable, impartial. He does not hate, nor does he forgive. The cycle is endless, and he is its servant." Clara, tears streaming down her face, whispered, "Then, what are we supposed to do?" Ella paused, her gaze sweeping over the group. Her voice softened, but carried an unshakable weight. "Learn. Seek to understand the illusions that brought you here. Ask yourself, does the offspring of the gazelle, the rabbit, the fly, or the zebra seek vengeance for the death of their family? Do the creatures you consume as food seek revenge upon you for eating their kin?" The group remained silent, their expressions conflicted. "You must understand," Ella continued, "that you cannot kill death. Sythras is death, a being that exists within the cycle, outside of human morality. His purpose is not vengeance or cruelty. It is survival, as primal and necessary as the lion's hunt." She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto each of them. "Take this as a lesson. Learn from it. Grow, flourish, live. Seek life and live, or seek death. The choice is yours, but know this. Should you choose vengeance, there will only ever be one outcome." Ella turned towards the darkness, where Sythras had vanished. "He may allow you to leave today, but if you linger or return, the cycle will not spare you again." The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of her words pressing down on them. Slowly, they began to gather their things, retreating toward the tunnel's entrance. As they disappeared into the shadows, Ella's final words echoed in their minds, and perhaps into the minds of all who listened. Will you cling to the past, which cannot be changed, or will you seek to live in the future